When I was asked to contribute to my thoughts on Bosnia-Herzegovina 20 years after Dayton, I realized that actually this is not an easy task for me. First of all, it's already quite some years since I left Bosnia-Herzegovina. I worked there between 1999 and 2002. And secondly, when I started to think about what we actually did during those roughly 3 years, I realized actually that if I would not put it down on paper, I would actually not be able to really focus on the essentials of our work there. So in order to respond to the three questions that were posed in a more sensible way on my take on Dayton, which ended the war but is not a real blueprint for a democratic European country, and then secondly, how did Bosnia-Herzegovina look in 1999, in the summer of 1999 when I arrived, and thirdly, what are the key achievements of my mandate there. Now, but let me first set the stage by describing very briefly what has happened in those years in the region, in the former Yugoslavia basically, and of course also internationally. There, the Kosovo intervention, the NATO intervention in early 1999 first comes to my mind. This really occupied the political attention of the international community, and even some of the resources and some of the best people that I had were then transferred to the peace mission to Kosovo. Now, the second thing was, and that was particularly dramatic in the year 2000, when in 1999 Croatian President Franjo Tuđman died, and in 2000 a new social democratic government and a president were elected who were definitely in favor of a united Bosnia-Herzegovina. So that was a very positive change. At the end of 2000, in the so-called October revolt in Belgrade, Milosevic was ousted. And also in 2000, President of Bosnia-Herzegovina, Alija Izetbegović, resigned. So within a very short period of time, within a few months only, the three main actors of the Bosnia drama were gone. That clearly also provided new opportunities for the peace implementation in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Now, but this was not the only thing. I've also marked down Macedonia. The European Union, obviously having learned from the previous disasters in the Balkans, was quick to react to the turmoil in Macedonia and mediated a peace deal which still holds up to this very day. Now, 2001 clearly is also very much marked by 9/11, this terrorist attacks that took place on the soil of the United States in New York and in Washington really affected the peace mission in Bosnia-Herzegovina as well in two ways. First of all, the United States clearly disengaged in many ways. The attention was clearly on the war on terror. And secondly, it affected in a direct way also our work there when 6 innocent Bosnians, the so-called Algerian 6, were taken to Guantanamo. Now, the US war on terror really changed in a very strong way our work there in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Now, how did Bosnia-Herzegovina look in 1999 when I arrived there, when my mandate began? Clearly, there were no armed hostilities any longer. Bosnia was, on the surface at least, quite peaceful. The humanitarian situation was improving, reconstruction of the physical infrastructure was well underway, and the basic living conditions started to improve. There was a certain sense of normalization and a perspective for a better future around. Still, there was very much unfinished business around. Actually, it was the time already under my predecessor Carlos Westendorp when the actual state building process started. Now, what were actually the main challenges between 1999 and 2002? Now, when I look back on my time as High Representative there, I have sort of organized the issues around 4 clusters. The first cluster I would call to reverse the ethnic cleansing and enforcing the right to return and the return of property repossession, as we have called it. That clearly was the core of the Dayton Accords and therefore very important. Now, within a relative short time span, hundreds of thousands of refugees and IDPs were able to return and got their property back, and even the NGO Human Rights Watch, which is usually not very positive when writing about state or international organizations, termed the year 2000 as the breakthrough in Bosnia in regard to property and refugee return. Now, my second cluster I would call building of a viable state of Bosnia and Herzegovina. We clearly know that the Dayton Accords provided for a highly decentralized state. The entities were highly autonomous, and it was my intention to outbalance the relationship between the state level and the 2 entities, to strengthen the state, so to speak. Now, there were a series of decisions which now fall into this cluster, I would say. I will only mention 3 major achievements. The first was the reform of the central government. As one example, there were only 3 ministries around. We were doubling the number of ministries where we were redistributing the work of those ministries. The second, and that was crucial and is probably almost forgotten nowadays, was the highly contentious creation of the State Border Service and the Central Customs Authority. Now, a third point which I would like to mention here was a robust reform of the judiciary system, which is still ongoing, I should say, and that included also the creation of the state court and then subsequently the state prosecutor. We are well aware that these days the state court and the state prosecutor are at the center of Dodik's referendum and secessionist rhetoric. So here we can see how, on the one hand, the State Border Service is really an accepted fact, whereas the judiciary system is still very much contested. Now, I would like to add 2 more examples of how we tried to strengthen the state governance system. The first was the introduction of a single passport, a unified non-ethnic ID card, and secondly, in the area of human security, we need to mention the creation of SIPA, the State Investigation and Protection Agency. This is arguably the most important contribution of the UN police mission to peace implementation in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Another issue that had a lasting impact on the governance system in Bosnia and Herzegovina was the reform of the entity constitutions, which provided equal rights to all 3 peoples in both entities. The Mrakovica-Sarajevo Agreement, as it was called, remains to this very day the only successful constitutional reform. It is the only time also that a compromise was hammered out with the help of OHR amongst the leading political parties in Bosnia. Now I would like to turn to the third cluster, and this I call the opening the way to Europe. The first highlight I would like to mention is the membership in the Council of Europe. Bosnia's accession to the Council of Europe was meant to start the long road of including Bosnia Herzegovina in the European democratic architecture. Now, a second point in this opening the way to Europe cluster, I would say, was the steps towards Brussels. They were facilitated together with Commissioner Lord Patten from the European Commission. The roadmap was established, a feasibility study about Bosnia-Herzegovina's readiness to join European structures was commissioned. Everything was to prepare for the SAA. Now, a third example, and this one I consider extremely important simply for the fact of its long-term effect on reconciliation and the stateness of Bosnia-Herzegovina. And this is the question how to deal with the past, how to tackle the legacy of the war. Now I'll give you three examples what we at the time between 1999 and 2002 could contribute to this very important process. The first was in 2000, we ordered the reconstruction of all destroyed mosques, churches and monasteries. And for this, I revitalized the Commission for the Preservation of Historic Monuments. This, by the way, is included as Annex 8 in the Dayton Accords. A second example is, and probably for me personally, the most difficult and at the time fiercely opposed proposal, and that was Srebrenica. Three decisions stand out. That is a decision on the location of the Srebrenica cemetery in Potocari, the memorial center there also in Potocari, and then the foundation of the Srebrenica Foundation. This all took place in the years 2000 and 2001. During this time, the apprehension of war criminals took on a new dimension, I should say, because S4 has become active in apprehending war criminals in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and this was, of course, also part of the cooperation with ICTY in The Hague, which was very close and very intense at the time. Now, my fourth and last cluster is the reform of the social, economic and business environment in Bosnia and Herzegovina. That clearly was no easy task, and the successes are not very impressive. Now, since the initial $5 billion rescue package was almost depleted, our task was to initiate the transformation of the country and its economy from an aid-driven economy to an investment-driven system. Changes in the tax system, social security, the pension system, new laws and regulations were necessary. Now finally, and I'm slowly coming to an end, considering all these changes, our approach also had to change. Now we decided to move from peace building to EU membership building, to go beyond Dayton. When I first arrived there, I quickly realized that there was something like a dependency syndrome very much visible and palpable in Bosnia, which basically means that Bosnians expected everything from the international community. So there was, in my opinion, a need for stakeholders, local stakeholders, to take up and actively approach changes, reforms that were necessary in the country. This was the time when I proposed what I had called at the time the ownership process. Odgovornost, samoodgovornost. You are responsible for your own country. We can help, we can assist you, but in the end, it's up to you to build your country. Now, for this, I intentionally tried to activate civil society there. There were many NGOs around, but there was not a feeling on my part that they were really all working towards the same goal, which means the creation of a viable state of Bosnia and Herzegovina. But there was also political progress. In 2000, the first non-nationalist government was formed, the so-called Coalition for Change. And the parties, Social Democrats, Liberals, Conservatives, they were all very much Europe-minded. So that helped a lot in order to promote the European agenda. Now let me close with this. My last major assignment was to propose a reform of the international presence in Bosnia, to draw down, to reduce the number of international organizations active in Bosnia, and also to streamline the work of OHR, the Office of the High Representative. The idea actually behind all of this was to transfer responsibility from OHR to the European Union. The EU should be the only game in town. Now, for a short while, we proposed there should be some sort of a double hatting. So my successor, Paddy Ashton, actually had two hats, so to speak. He was the High Representative, and at the same time, he became the first EU Special Representative for Bosnia and Herzegovina. Now, everybody agreed that the phasing out of the relatively small and not so important UN mission was a first step towards handing over responsibility to the Europeans, so that the Europeans could take full charge and to move swiftly from Dayton, beyond Dayton, to Brussels. Unfortunately, this remains unfulfilled to this very day. However, there is hope, in my opinion. And to overcome this over-ethnicization of Bosnia and Herzegovina, the ethnic divisions that characterize so much of the impasse in the country, the division in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And this was, in my opinion, expressed very aptly during the demonstrations and protests of February 2014 in Tuzla, Sarajevo, and so on, when the protesters had a slogan which very much impressed me, and this reads like this: Gladni smo na tri jezika. I do hope, and I sincerely hope, that this is a first, albeit very weak, sign and indication that Bosnia-Herzegovina can indeed, when it really engages, when it really takes ownership of its own country, succeed.